Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Rod Smola, and I'm a happy member of the church here, along with my wife, Anya. We live across the street. She's affectionately known as the church flower lady, I think, now. And welcome to the United Church of Strafford for the latest in our series, Election 2024, What is at Stake? Here in the church, we always begin by acknowledging that we are on the ancestral and unceded land of the traditional caretakers, the Western Abenaki people. Part of our stewardship of this land is to govern the society that inhabits it responsibly. And that means, in part, being well informed and actively engaged in electoral politics. We are hosting the series in our church sanctuary because we believe this is a sacred duty, and our choices need to be made in the context of our highest ethical values and philosophical ideals. But I am admonished to warn by the Internal Revenue Service, this is in no way a religious event. We have no agenda other than our two stated goals. First, to educate ourselves about what is at stake in the November election, and second, to inspire ourselves to become active and devote time and resources to help elect candidates who are more aligned with the nation and world we want to create, whoever those candidates may be. We intend to abide well within the IRS requirements, just in case the sanctuary is bugged, which means that we will not directly or indirectly endorse or oppose any candidate. We have asked all the speakers in this series to make clear the difference between the two major parties and their candidates on the particular set of issues they are addressing. So whatever your perspective, we welcome you here. The church aspires to be a safe place for people of differing views with regard to one another, respect, with compassion and care. We listen deeply to understand the other's perspectives, even if we do not share them. Our format will be that our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have some question and answer period in which you're invited to ask questions or share your thoughts. Finally, the fact that we are conducting this series with an element of neutrality doesn't mean that as individuals we cannot feel strong emotions and passionate concerns. The aim is to illuminate the issues. Please remember that we are here because we share what our neighbor, William Sloane Coffin, called a passion for the possible. We're here because we all want a nation that fulfills its highest ideals and is a blessing to its people and to the world. So let us put our hearts and minds together as one for the good of all. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Jameson C. Davis. Jameson is a dedicated and passionate advocate for energy and environmental issues, as well as community empowerment, with over 8 years of specialized industry experience. I am particularly proud to say that he holds a JD degree and a Master of Environmental Law and Policy from Vermont Law and Graduate School. He's been a consistent champion of the rights of sacrificed communities and underserved populations. His career is marked by a relentless commitment to fostering positive change and advancing social justice. This has been demonstrated through his service as a Selectboard Member for the Town of Hartford, his leadership as president of Writing Wrongs LLC, and his role as co-founder of the African American Society number 024. He's also a published author. His work is The History of How Low-Income and Predominantly Black Unincorporated Communities Evolved to Become Environmental Justice Communities Through State Annexation Laws and Procedures. This appeared in the Vermont Journal of Environmental Law, Volume 22. I was chatting with him before the service. He lives in Connecticut, in Hamden, near New Haven, but he is in Vermont all the time. He's currently the chair of the Equity Committee of the Vermont Natural Resources Council. He's a board member for the Hamden Education Foundation back in Connecticut. He continues to lead critical discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. He provides strategic, municipal, and organizational consulting work. He's co-authored environmental justice legislation and anti-racism policies and procedures that he has been the author of have been adopted by numerous municipalities, school districts, and organizations at local, regional, and national levels. Jameson, we're delighted to have you here back home in Vermont. We're delighted to have you addressing our congregation. Will you all please join me in welcoming Jameson Davis?
All right. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Greatly appreciate your time. Greatly appreciate an excuse to come to Vermont. For those who know me, know that I love coming to Vermont. Quick story is that when I cross over into the state, my heart rate always drops. I don't know why, but every time I cross over out of Massachusetts, and I understand nobody likes Massachusetts, keep that between us, but my heart rate drops. Thank you for having me. Greatly appreciate it. We're just going to have a good discussion, have some fun. But also, do our best to leave out here a little bit more knowledgeable about the issues, specifically about individual rights. So without further ado, because I only have an hour, and if you know Miss Cameron Speth, you know I actually have only an hour. So let's get started, okay? Vin, you want me to let you know? Is that okay?
Yeah, you want slides now?
Yep, we can get started. Awesome. So I do want to set a parameter and just let folks know that, the presentation has changed quite a bit, right? When I was informed about this opportunity, I took some time to develop a presentation that I would come back to later, but things have changed in about 3 weeks ago, right? We're all aware of what happened. So what you'll notice, a little bit of a difference, because again, my whole goal is to be as secular as possible, right? And stay neutral. But what you'll notice is that there will be some more details on the Republican side than it was the Democratic Party, simply because the Democratic Party hasn't released yet specifics in terms of policies and procedures and things of that nature. Versus on the Republican side, because President Trump, 45th president, was already president, we can kind of assume and engage the continuation of what might happen based on what's happening in the past of the presidency, okay? So you'll see that little bit of a difference, is that there'll be more details on one side than the other, and that's just the reason why, okay? Okay, no worries. So we'll get started in terms of the goals, right? So the goals for today is really just to provide a clear and factual overview of key individual rights in the 2024 election. Okay, it's to encourage everybody here to think critically and to evaluate the information being presented, okay? Information I'm presenting to you and any information you might learn between now and November. To break down complex legal and policy issues in understandable terms. To highlight the practical implications of these issues on everyday life, right? So how are some of these decisions that are being made for you based on how you vote affecting your quality of life, right? Whatever that may be. And then lastly, just to emphasize the importance of participation in the democratic process and to protect and promote individual rights. Y'all excited? You ready? Yeah. Let's do it. All right. So topics covered. Oh yeah, great timing. Thank you, Vin. Vin is on it. So topics covered. You can probably go to the third slide, I believe. Thank you. Yep, one more back. Awesome. Okay. So Project 2025, I know people have probably heard that so many times. Like, what is that? What's 2025? So we'll cover, again, an overview basis of the document and what that means and what that could potentially lead to, or what the effects are on individual rights, right? With the focus on individual rights. We'll talk about the Supreme Court, right? Because who you vote for most definitely can have an impact on the Supreme Court. And that in return will have an impact on your quality of life. So we'll talk about that briefly. We'll talk about criminal justice. We'll talk about access to health care, women's rights and reproductive rights, and then immigration as well. So we got quite a few topics that we're covering. And that's not all the topics that need to be covered, right? Again, I only have an hour. So there's, there's indigenous rights that, and many of other things that I have at the end of my list to remind you of. But just to let you know, we're covering only an hour, so we're just gonna gotta give a very detailed as possible overview as the main topics as we can touch. Okay? Ben? So first, the candidates. So Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, excuse me. So as you know, the 49th Vice President, Kamala, let me get that right first of all. Let everybody know, Kamala Harris. Kamala, right? Okay, so now we got that out the way. Second thing we got to get out the way as well is that her father is Jamaican American, so therefore she's black. Okay, so two things we got out the way right off the bat, right? Kamala and she's black. Great, let's move on. So one thing I really wanted to focus on is I want you to focus on a lot of their wording that they're using, right? The different parties. So Kamala's and her party is really going for hope for tomorrow. These are some of the terminologies they use, right? Stronger together, move forward, we won't go back. Right? I want you to think about that. Let that seep in for a second because it's going to come back later. Hope for tomorrow, stronger together, move forward, we won't go back. Okay, next slide. And then we have the Trump-Vance party. All right, ticket, I should say, excuse me. Their slogans, make America great again, save America, keep America great. Again, just let that sink in and remember, because we're going to go back to both these, right? Make America great again, or just make America great. Save America, and keep America great. Right, so you're already seeing a contrast in themes, right? One's thinking a little bit more future, right? Hope for tomorrow, stronger together. And one's thinking a little bit more present and past tense, right? Let's go back and make America great again. Save America, right, from what's to come. Keep America great. So you can already kind of see the contrasting elements that the campaigns are putting out there, okay? Next slide. So one way I was roughing my brain of how we're gonna kind of simplify this all together within an hour, where people can have digestible terminology and things of that nature. So I do this talk quite often when I'm doing a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion training, but I think it actually applies very well here for where we are, which is the melting pot dilemma, right? And the bipartisan examination of that. So raise your hand if when you were in school, when you were growing up, the way that you were taught about our differences is really, we're all the same. Hey, we're all exactly the same. We're just one big melting pot that creates this great country, right? There's no differences between us. We're exactly the same, right? That's a lot of us were taught. I know I was taught that way. I know that for a fact. In Connecticut, elementary school, it was presented to us in that way, right? But think about it again, what is a melting pot? Right? You take this element or this crucible, heat it up as much as you can, take a bunch of different metals, some iron, some steel, maybe some zinc, aluminum. You put it in here, you heat it up till it gets orange, you put it into something you want to cool it, and whatever it cools into, the dominant metal is kind of what you see. Right? So if there's more steel in there than iron or aluminum, then you see the look of steel, right? So all the other metals kind of get absorbed, and they're not even noticed, right? Some might even say, those who work in steel, work in iron, work in metal, can tell you, oh, there's also going to be impurities there as well, right? So I want you to think about that in one way in terms of where we are and potentially where we can go, right? And how your voting will impact that. Next slide for me. So I often like to think of what that actually means, right? So the melting pot theory is really preaching assimilation of cultures, right? So let me just give you a quick definition of assimilation so that way we can all be on the same page. It occurs when groups from different heritages are absorbed into the dominant culture of society. Assimilation is more of an extreme form of change in an individual's cultural identification and involves the complex adoption of one culture and the rejection of a previous culture. Okay? So you're asking folks to assimilate into this dominant major culture because, hey, you came here, so just be more like us. We're all one. We're all the same over here, right? Multiculturalism. Now, that's more of a term that deals with, think of a gumbo or salad. Depending on where I am, who my audience is, I either say salad or gumbo, right? But I think y'all got some Southern in you, so I'll say gumbo for y'all. But understand that every ingredient in the gumbo needs to be there. And they all stay what it is. Tomato stays tomatoes. If it's seafood gumbo, then you got your crab in there and your shrimp in there and you got all your different seasonings in there, right? And if you're missing one thing, you know it's missing. You're saying, wait a second, where's the curry or where's the, whatever the special seasoning that you use, right? Paprika or Lowry's seasoning salt, where is it? I'm not tasting it, right? And so multiculturalism, let's talk about that real quick, is a belief that all cultures are of equal value. It can also be a policy that promotes and protects diversity in a culture by honoring multiple ethnicities, languages, religions, cultural customs. In addition, multiculturalism encourages open-mindedness amongst different groups of people, and it dispels negative stereotypes. So what I want you to kind of think about in the back of your head is, as we're moving forward with this discussion, think to yourself, okay, do these policies kind of push us into this melting pot? Or these policies push us into gumbo? Right? And then you have to decide for yourselves, what kind of society do you want to have? Do you want to have a melting pot society? Or do you want to have gumbo? Right? So this is kind of a way that I thought would help us at least differentiate the differences between the two campaigns and the two parties. Okay, so as we move forward, again, think about this. Is this gumbo rhetoric or is this melting pot rhetoric? All right, next slide. So we'll start with Project 2025. What is Project 2025? All right, it's a federal policy agenda blueprint for a restructuring of the executive branch, authored and published by some former Trump administration officials, in partnership with the Heritage Foundation, which is a long-standing conservative think tank. And within the document, it opposes things like reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ rights, immigrants' rights, racial equity. The largest publication so far is a mandate, and the mandate is about 900 pages. And that 900-page document dispels and lays out, in particular, all the things policy and procedure-wise that they're looking for restructuring, right? Giving more potential power to the executive branch and the ways in which they are going about doing that. Talk about some of their proposed agendas, right? So we're talking about hundreds of individual policy changes that will really impact a lot of constitutional rights, and we'll go into a little bit more discussion of what those rights are. But the overview is you're looking at potential gutting abortion access, mass deportations, abuse warrantless surveillance, unleashing undue force on protesters, severely limiting voting access, centering critical discussions in the classroom, rolling back trans rights, rolling back environmental laws and policies. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. Actually, you know what? We'll go back one more, sorry. We'll wait there. So what are some of these potential restructurings we're talking about? So we'll go to a little bit more detail as fast as possible. So it really wants to restructuring the federal agencies, right? EPA, things of that nature, which is, they're really kind of advocating for a more streamlined or even oftentimes dismantling of certain, as I said, federal agencies due to what they consider to be inefficient regulations, or even sometimes they categorize as overreaching regulations. And this could involve like emerging departments, eliminating whole departments, anything of that nature, specific regulatory bodies, again, all to increase potentially executive power. Judicial appointments and legal reforms. The plan is really to kind of emphasize the need to appoint judges who would adhere to kind of a really strict originalist interpretation. So what that means for some is the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. All right, the Constitution should be read as if it was written, as if it applies as if it was written when it was written. Okay, so though society might have changed, cultures might have changed, morals might have changed, the document has not. All right, the originalist theory is that the document stays exactly how it was written, by the Federalists or by our founding fathers. Okay. A couple different changes is federal workforce overhaul. So Schedule F reform. So one of the most discussable aspects in the proposal is actually a Schedule F, which is a plan to reclassify many federal workers, making it easier for them to fire, removing, again, a constitutional due process. Okay, due process is a constitutional right. This is one of the ways and potentially that they're trying to remove it, or not one of the ways, but something they acknowledge of what they're trying to remove. Policy enforcement and deregulation. The project includes proposals to significantly roll back regulations over various sectors, particularly environmental and labor laws. They have a really kind of eye for environmental and labor laws. We're a capitalistic society, so when you remove environmental laws, potentially that opens up doorways for organizations and corporations to make more money and to not be as concerned with environmental and pollution issues. And then you have immigration and border control, right? Which is calls for tightening, stricter enforcement, measures to reduce legal immigration and increase deportations, access to legal individuals and legal resources for those who need it. So these are, again, all just different ways in which Project 2025 has acknowledged some of the policy structures in which they're going to be seeking. More specific concerns in terms of like reproductive rights and civil liberties is, again, freedom of speech and expression. First Amendment obviously covers that, right? The regulation of media, right? They want to increase control of the media, potentially regulation of online content, the right to privacy, which is the Fourth Amendment, which is covered by the Fourth Amendment, specifically when it comes to surveillance. Project 2025 has a section that talks about surveillance expansion, especially when it comes to data, right? The key term right now is the word data. Data and surveillance are actually separate, right? So if you want to technically surveil, but you don't want to call it surveillance, you can just, right now, call it data, right, to an extent, right? And think about how much data you give to somebody every day, right? If you're posting stuff online all the time, that's data, right? That's not anybody surveilling you. But the courts, I'm sure, will figure that out over the years. I'm sure somebody will bring something up. And then the LGBTQ plus rights, right? Marriage equality, anti-discrimination protections. The project really talks about the potential reshaping the judicial and conservative judges, really through the appointment of federal judges. As you know, the president has the responsibility to fill in federal judges. And so, we know Trump has, I believe, in his first year, filled in, I'm not sure the number, but there were quite a few. And I apologize for not knowing the number. But that has a tremendous impact on people's quality of lives, and tremendous impact on rulings, and tremendous impact on the ways that laws and procedures are used in those districts, but potentially also the Supreme Court, which we'll go more into. And then the immigration rights, which is protected by the 14th and 5th Amendment. All right, due process, refugee protections, all those things as well. They have identified areas that they will be targeting. Voting rights, okay, 15th Amendment, which is covered by that. Again, we're just talking about constitutional rights right now that Project 2025 has acknowledged that they would like to see some restructuring. So voting rights, the right to protest and assembly as well, covered by the First Amendment. Racial equality is another topic they cover. Healthcare rights, right? Want to focus on reducing federal oversight and rolling back the Affordable Care Act. So kind of getting rid of what's there in terms of the federal government and really allowing the corporations and big pharma to step back in and to kind of retake and rehab that sector and that industry. Okay, and so now that we know so much about Project 2025, we could talk about what are, the contrast between the parties and what they feel about 2025, right? So, Vin, if you can go next slide for me. So the Democratic Party, as you can see, opposes Project 2025 and its changes. Based off of tradition, we know that they have a commitment to protecting individual rights through legislation and executive action. Okay? The Republican side, and here's where a little bit I want to read on the Trump ticket, which is he has come out and claimed that he's not connected to Project 2025, so I want that to be known, okay? But a report recently done by CNN found that at least 140 people, 140, who worked on Project 2025 previously worked in the Trump administration, okay? The Heritage Foundation president, Kevin Roberts, also previously worked on Trump's transition team in 2016 and has described his own organizational role as institutionalizing Trumpism. Okay? So I do want to acknowledge what was said, but I also want to acknowledge what was reported and found through journalistic investigation. Now, I do want to take a second really quick, if I may, just to emphasize, the importance of understanding like states' rights and traditional values and why that might be a talking point for certain parties. Because when you're able to give states more rights, there's things that, states can do, right? They can do more. They can set more laws. They have more leniency. They're not too worried about preemption, things of that nature. So let me give you a couple of examples of what that can lead to. So currently, Georgia, building a website with taxpayer money to let people cancel someone else's voter registration. Website being built right now, right? 16 Republicans-led states are suing to end the program that offers undocked spouses married to U.S. citizens a path to citizenship. The Democrats on the other side have a policy that says parole in place, which allows them to go through the process here in the states versus having to separate families. Okay, again, we're just giving contrasting terms. We're not saying what's better, what's worse, we're just giving you contrasting terms. All right, the U.S. District Court of Western District of Louisiana, and this just happened about 4 or 5 days ago, issued a permanent injunction preventing the EPA and DOJ from using Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to control how Louisiana regulates polluting facilities. So they were trying to include disparate impacts, which pretty much just gets a cumulative look of what's already in that community and how that community has already been impacted desperately, by having multiple polluting facilities and byproduct pollution happening within that community. The court struck that down, saying that pollution does not discriminate. Okay? Again, Trump appointee federal judge. So our voting, our individual rights are affected by all of our votes, not just at the obviously local, regional level, but your quality of life is impacted based on who you vote for president as well, because they have powers that allow them to make decisions that could potentially immediately have an impact on your quality of life. So we go from there to the Supreme Court context. If you can jump on the next slide for me, Vin. And so we just want to point out real quick that in his first term, President Trump had the opportunity to appoint, does anybody know how many Supreme Court justices he had? You got it, Susan? 3, right? 3. 3, no problem, right? Obama had to fight for that one. He didn't get the end, but again, let me keep it secular. Sorry, my apologies. I digressed. Okay, so again, these have tremendous impacts on people's quality of life and their individual rights, right? I'll just name a couple of the cases that the Supreme Court has ruled on based off of the current lean, which is a little bit more, not a little bit more, but just more conservative than it is liberal, based off of the appointments that 45th President Trump had the opportunity to appoint. So everybody knows the first one, right? Dobbs versus Jackson's World Health Organization. That's reproductive rights. That's abortion, right? The impact. This landmark decision overturned Roe v. Wade, which was as far back as 1973. Okay? And Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992. Nearly 50 years of federal protection for abortion rights removed, the ruling returned the authority to regulate abortion to the states, leading to a wave of restrictive abortion laws across the country. Right? Again, we talked about state powers and what could potentially happen when you give states more power. States can make the decisions that they want to make, right? Brovich versus the Democratic National Committee. The impact here is that the decision upheld 2 Arizona voting laws that critics argue disproportionately affect minority voters. The ruling made it more difficult to challenge voting restrictions under the Voting Rights Act, which obviously, as we know, can potentially lead to further voter restriction and further voter suppression. Rucho, and I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong, I apologize, versus Common Clause. Right, the impact here is that the federal courts cannot review cases of partisan gerrymandering, effectively allowing states to draw electoral district lines in a manner that benefits the ruling party. This decision has made a significant impact, obviously, to the electoral fairness, right? We are familiar with gerrymandering and how effective that can be for one party or the other. And the last one we'll talk about is West Virginia versus the EPA. The court limited the EPA's authority to regulate carbon emissions from power plants, significantly impacting environmental regulations and the federal government's ability to address climate change. Further broadens the trend of limiting regulatory power. And then one that I didn't write down, but we can talk about briefly, is affirmative action, right? The effects on affirmative action actually are, I think, far more ranging than what people realize, right? Because really what the court was saying there is that you really can't use race as a factor, right? So now, if somebody's maybe doing some environmental work or doing any other work where they want to use race as a factor, they have to rethink that, right? Even when it comes to potentially giving relief to things and to people, specifically people who may have been impacted because of their race, can now no longer receive potential resources that was designed based on the individuals who were impacted, if race is a factor, right? And that goes across the board, really to anything, right? Because it's a Supreme Court ruling. All right, so understand again, individual rights being affected based off of the voting and the voting power, okay? Future implications, we know, the justices potentially are aging like everybody does. Let me just pull up their, oh, I had it somewhere, excuse me. But potentially there's, in this next administration, opportunity to appoint at least one, potentially, depending on health and things. We wish everybody well, but you just never know, We didn't expect the president to drop out of the race as well. So voting has a tremendous impact on the Supreme Court and what can happen there. So we'll take a look at the next slide for me, Vin. Women's rights, which we talked briefly about, but we'll go a little bit more into detail here. And again, this is a 2-hour presentation on its own. Okay, so bear with me as I try to cram it in there. All right. So after the Dobbs case that I mentioned earlier, let's take a look at the current overview of what states have done since they've had this right? So since June 24 of about 2022, 14 states have banned abortion across the United States, largely concentrated, as you can see, in the South, okay? 6 states do not have exceptions for when the pregnant person's health is at risk. 10 states have no rape, incest exceptions, and 13 states have no fatal-fetal anomaly exceptions. Okay? One thing I do want to point out it's a desperate impact that potentially has and also causes for a number of reasons, but one I want to point out is women of color. So women of color, specifically black women, have a much higher rate of really difficult pregnancies and issues within pregnancy, right? So if you don't have any type of exception that talks about, the person's health at risk, then that really has an impact on a specific community, right? Especially ones that have higher rates of, very tough pregnancies and very tough birthings for a number of reasons. We know why those are. We don't need to go into today, but it's just fact, okay? All right. 6 in 10 black and American Indian or Alaskan women between the ages of 18 to 41 live in states with abortion bans. Let me repeat that again. 60%, 6 in 10 black and American Indian or Alaskan Native women, 60, ages between 18 to 41 live in states with abortion bans. All right, so again, people of color residing in these states where abortion bans are severely restricted and could face disproportionate challenges accessing the reproductive rights. So since the Dobbs decision, abortion providers and advocates in 23 states have challenged the legality of the state. And so, things are going through the courts as well. The impact on state level restrictions and federal responses, is increased state autonomy to trigger laws and total bans, impact on healthcare access, and then the criminalization, the literal criminalization of abortion, okay? So what are the perspectives in terms of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, right? Again, a lot of this is based on tradition. Advocacy, the Democratic Party advocates for codifying Roe v. Wade at the federal level through a government, all right? Some even talk about the possibility of an executive order. There's all kind of things that could potentially happen. Impact of state level restrictions and federal the support of broader reproductive health care access, okay? Versus the Republican Party supports for, again, states' voting right to regulate abortion, which we have seen, and the promotion of alternatives to abortion and restrictions on federal funding. Next slide, please. So we'll spend some time, we get a time check, okay, I'm doing pretty well. Keeping it on my hour cam, don't worry. Immigration and refugee rights, okay? Sorry. Here we go. So we'll look at the current policies of both parties. And again, as I stated earlier, you'll see some more detailed on one side because we know that party versus the other side because it's brand new. They haven't released any of their policies and procedures yet. So we can't really dissect it as much as we can on one side. So I just want to reiterate that in terms of why there's so much detail for one side versus the other. The Harris-Walz ticket has broadly released some things they would like to do, but they haven't followed up yet with any policies and procedures of how they're going to do it. Versus we already know what has happened previously, okay? So current immigration policies and laws. So policies under the first administration of Trump, border security and immigration. The Trump administration prioritized a stronger border security, including construction of the border wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Also implemented a zero tolerance policy. And this led to, the families being separated. We saw the images of the cages and things of that nature under his first presidency. Total travel ban, okay? Refugee admissions, they enacted the Muslim ban, okay, which restricted entry into the U.S. from several Muslim countries. Refugee admissions were significantly reduced, with an annual cap lowered to its lowest level in modern history, okay? So very few, if any, refugees were coming through, regardless of what the issues were or where they were coming from. Then you have DACA and you have TPS, right? DACA, the deferred actions for childhood arrivals, and then TPS, the temporary protective status. The administration there attempted to end DACA, and then sought to also terminate the TPS as well. So, again, you can kind of see the pattern here, understand, you know, what one party leans towards in terms of their thoughts and ideas. Closing a border, more secure border, less refugees, you know, really trying to make it a not so easy country to get into, even though we're a country built off immigrants, correct? Then you have the asylum policy, right, from the first Trump presidency, which is they saw significant restrictions on the asylum. They remain in Mexico. So that was something that interesting I had to work on in my time at the Attorney General's office here in Vermont, is the remain in Mexico policy, which requires asylum seekers to wait in Mexico as they were going through the process. And then, you know, when it comes to, one thing I do want to point out when it comes to refugees and it comes to border security is the environmental side of things, right? So climate refugees is something that's going to be, I think, to me, something we really have to pay attention to, especially in a place like Vermont, especially in the upper Northeast, you know, in the New England area. Because climate refugees it's already happening. We're already seeing a large swath of individuals and communities having to move across, you know, parts of the country. Not always obviously ending up here in America, but people are already moving. They're already being affected, whether it's the sea level rise or whether it's extreme weathers that have never happened in that community. I mean, we all know here in Vermont, we've experienced 100-year floods every 5 or so years, right? They're no longer 100-year floods at this point, right? So, and we're a very developed country, so imagine what it looks like in other areas, okay? And so I think that's something to, again, think about in your head. And remember, what the first initial thing was that we talked about, these policies. We're talking about these policies, closed borders, you know, challenges on reproductive rights. Where does that fall, right? Is that the melting pot? Or is that the gumbo, right? If we're closing our borders and we don't want different folks, and whatever the case may be, for yourself, you decide. I'm not going to tell you. You decide, right? Where is it? It's a melting pot or is it gumbo? And then you also decide, do you want to live in a melting pot or do you want to live in some gumbo, right? So what are the perspectives between the two? Again, overview. The Democratic perspective is the support for comprehensive immigration reform. Again, they could do that through legislation. They can do that through potential EOs, executive orders, advocacy for humane treatment of refugees, asylum seekers with consideration for climate refugees. And on the flip side, we have focus on border security, enforcement of existing laws, and opposition to broader refugee status for climate-related migration. Next slide, please. All right, and then we'll do criminal justice. So incarceration rates here in America, as folks may or may not know, are extremely high. So one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. 2.3 million people. With a disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx community, largely due to the war on drugs and things of that nature. So we'll take a look, and again, we'll zoom by the next couple of slides because I don't want to take too much time, but go back one more for me. It's okay. The expansion of, go back one more. Okay, my bad. I skipped over healthcare, excuse me. So let's do that, my apologies. My apologies. So go back one more for me.
Go back?
Oh, 4, sorry.
All right.
Yeah. There we go. Now we're on the same page. Okay, now we're good to go. Apologies for that. All right, so the Affordable Health Care Act, right? So Democratic perspective here is to expand the ACA, support for public health care options, and focus on reducing disparities in healthcare access. okay? As you talked about a little bit earlier, in terms of how they potentially go about doing that, in terms of just having more government insight, more government involvement, making sure that the industry is just not ran by Big Pharma itself. And Big Pharma aren't setting prices and things of that nature. There's been a lot of subsidies happening, specifically in the Biden administration for specific drugs, insulin being one of them, and a laundry list of many others that are currently a lot less cheaper now than they were just 4 years ago, okay? And on the Republican side, it's to repeal and place the Affordable Care Act with market-based solutions, emphasis on reducing federal involvement. Again, as we just said, is to be able to give more leniency and power to organizations, okay? Not really, I mean, we can go into a ton more detail. I mean, there are certain repels of individual mandates, the expansion of the short-term health care plans, the now Medicaid work requirements, which wasn't a thing before. They now require certain workers and individuals who do work or volunteer to participate in trainings. And then they're really kind of just requirements intended to promote self-efficiency. And that's really kind of pretty much it. They're just trying to make it more difficult for policies to really get billed out. So the corporations can just have more funds and not have to be billing out as much, you know, due to whatever the complications may be healthcare-wise. And so now we can go to the next slide, Vin. Sorry about that.
You're good.
Thank you. So now criminal justice, right? So the 2.3 million people incarcerated in the U.S., 32% of the U.S. population represented by African American Hispanics, compared to the 56% in the U.S. incarcerated population. Okay. The Democratic perspective is to advocate for comprehensive criminal justice reform, including sentencing reform, policy of police accountability, and rehabilitation programs, and focus on reducing systemic racism within the justice system. Now, this is also a conversation happening in the Democratic Party as well, which is Kamala has obviously been a DA who has been somebody who has fought in the war on drugs on the front lines. So there's a conversation there around, you know, will these reforms actually happen under her watch, right? She's somebody who has been tough, very, very tough, very, very, very tough on, you know, certain communities and individuals and things of that nature. She has done amazing work as a DA as well, representing families' housing. So again, it's just a conversation. Just folks are trying to better understand, you know, her policies, her theories, things of that nature, to really kind of gauge, is she, you know, somebody to lead us to more restorative justice, which, you know, I shout out to Vermont Law School for being the first law school to offer that as a Vermont Law and Graduate School, I got used to saying, excuse me, for being one of the first schools, I think the first school actually to offer a restorative justice master's. It's only a matter of time for them to offer a doctorate at some point. And then Republican perspective, right? The emphasis on law and order, support for strong policing, advocacy for judicial reforms that emphasize punishment over rehabilitation. Okay, again, stark contrast. Very, very stark, right? Extremely. But again, think back to that original thought, right? Which one's maybe a little bit more melting pot leaning? Which one's a little bit more maybe gumbo leaning, right? Can you start to kind of see everything that we talked about one way or another can be put in maybe potentially one or two of those categories, right? I just wanted to try to give you something to revert back to as we're going, because I'm throwing a lot of information at you in a very short amount of time, okay? All right, next slide. So, just want to summarize what we did talk about, and I have a couple things that just to mention really quickly that we didn't talk about. So let's discuss what we did, right? Project 2025. The opposition to 25, the Democrats oppose these proposed changes, and the changes that we talked about cover everything from executive powers, okay, And then the Republicans, obviously, not obviously, but potentially are in support of the framework, and that's based off of, again, the individuals who created the document being so tied into the administration, the current administration, and the president himself, serving for him one way or another, either through the administration or previous campaigns. The Supreme Court. Democrats likely to nominate justices focused on expanding and protecting individual rights, versus the contrast is likely to nominate conservative judges that are aligned with a more traditional, original interpretation of the Constitution. And we talked about the differences of those, right? Reproductive rights, women's rights. Democrats support access to abortion, codify Roe v. Wade, expand contraception and education. We didn't talk about contraception as much as well, but that's, again, another topic that we can also talk about. Within the 2 hours, we can talk about, just that topic alone. Republicans advocate for abortion restrictions, state-level bans, and alternatives. All right. Immigration and refugee rights. Democrats comprehensive reform, humane treatment, and expand admissions and family reunification, versus stricter enforcement, limited admissions, and a focus on broader security on the Republican side. Okay. Healthcare access, expand access to the Affordable Care Act and universal coverage, reduce costs as a right, versus the contrast, reduce government involvement and support free market solutions, which again, as we mentioned quite a few times, just really gives the corporations more leniency and more power. And there were a couple things that we really didn't have enough time to go deep into, but LGBTQ rights, right? Trans rights, humongous in terms of the impact of who you're voting for, right? And again, remember that melting pot, right? Remember that melting pot, okay? Racial justice and civil rights, and we briefly went over some of those, but there's plenty and plenty more to discuss there. I guess the really thing I want to leave you with before we go into our question and answer, because I think I'm right on my time. I don't think that clock is right back there. No, okay, I figured that out. I'm like, it's not moving, and I keep looking at it. Okay, I figured it out. Now, call to action. So I really just want to encourage everybody who's here, everybody who's watching, to just focus on your research, okay? Be critical in your pursuit of truth, okay? Ask questions to yourself, ask questions to loved ones. Don't be afraid to have conversations. There are some folks you have to know who you haven't had conversations with, obviously. Don't have it over the dinner table. That's always bad. Mom never likes that. But just know that the best and biggest thing you can do is just educate yourself. And so I hope today, at least I was able to give you some broad things you can go back home to and just do some more research on. You're always welcome to, go to the last slide for me. You can always welcome to get a hold of me as well. One more. It's my email address here, which is jameson@writingwrongs.llc.com. You're more than welcome to send me questions. If my presentation wasn't too bad for you, you invite me to come do more. That's also a thing as well. I do have to say that this was a lot to get into an hour, so that was probably the hardest thing I had to do, was figure out how to get it all into an hour. But I do appreciate the opportunity to do so, and I really do hope that I was able to give you some food for thought and some opportunity to learn more and to be critical in your thinking. So thank you for your time. So I know there's a Q&A point, so I just want to see what that may be.
I don't really have a question yet, but I just wanted to thank you for that fabulous analogy of the melting pot and explaining it versus gumbo or salad and explaining that.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. That was great. I think I know which way I'm going on this selection.
I don't hear that. I don't know. I have no idea what that is.
But let me just relate to this group. Not so much a question to you, but a point that I thought I'd make. In the convention, the Democrats just had, we heard a lot about how great America is, right? And this is the finest country on the planet and the best democracy. And we must not have much of a climate problem because we didn't talk about that at all. And let me just mention a few sort of reality points. Yes. It's a group of universities do an environmental performance index that analyzes where the various countries stand on environmental performance. And if you look, what you find is the United States is very far from the top. Maybe number 50 in the world among all the countries. Even worse on climate performance, and terrible on biodiversity performance, way down the list. All right. If you look at the Economist Index of Democratic Performance, you find that the U.S. Maybe is like, 15th, I don't want to exaggerate, in terms of sheer democratic performance in the world, as opposed to listening to the convention and getting the sense that we might be the only living democracy on the planet. You mentioned incarceration, and how we are superlative in our number of people in jail. And you can go through a whole host of other social statistics like that, in education accomplishment, in healthcare, and the unbelievable amount of money we spend for some of the worst results. UNICEF does a ranking of countries in child welfare and treatment of children. We're way down the list. So it goes on like that. And the problem I have is that, if we don't talk about the seriousness and the depths of some of these issues, then it's a way of not acknowledging them. We can say, oh, we know that. We're just trying to get through this thing politically, right? These are inconvenient truths that we don't really want to talk about because we've got to win this damn election. But the fact is, there is a problem if we don't talk about these things. And if we pretend, for an awful lot of people who don't bother to look up OECD statistics and UN data, which show, for example, on the Human Development Index, the U.S. has fallen dramatically among the world's countries in the last 15 years. If you don't know all that, then you may think that that's really what America is, and people scratch their heads because they know their lives are not like that's been described. So anyhow, I just throw that out. I felt like I had to unburden myself with this observation.
Always appreciate it. You kidding me? Thank you.
Well, I think, Gus, that's so helpful to remember all of that and to take it in much more deeply. And while I was listening, I was thinking of the ways in which the Democrats, and I'm totally a Democrat, don't ever want to set limits on things, and that some of those categories that you went through could be a category, you could look at a bigger category in terms of, are there some limits or not? The Republicans want a lot more limits, and maybe that would be for future compromise. But my question, coming from what Gus said, is what is the right time for bringing out more of these truths, difficult truths, much more than inconvenient truths, life and death truths in so many ways. And so either you said or Gus said or you both said that it's about winning the election now if you're a Democrat. And I don't know what the answer is, but I would like to just say that. What is the right time?
Well, I definitely don't have the answer. But here's what I'll say, which is, I think young people right now are answering that question for us. Because they are demanding we talk about these things. What I'm realizing about young folks is they don't care about previous etiquette. Etiquette? So, for example, 3 months before election, you shouldn't be talking about these heartfelt issues. You shouldn't be talking about what's going on in Gaza or anything else that's happening in the country, you know, especially what's going on in Sudan and all of these international. We should be worried about what's going on here, here only. But these young people are like, absolutely not. You know, they live in a globalized world, right? They might have friends in these places that they talk to on a daily basis because they could just pick up social media and do it. So these issues now are their issues, right? For so long, especially my generation, and for sure your generation, we only knew the issues in our country, for the most part, right? What was given to us on news, sure, yeah, we got that, you know, and we would know about the big stuff, right? The big wars, right? This new generation knows about everything. They know about community clashes, right? They know what wars within wars. And the issues very specific in particular of how they started. They're a very educated group. And so to answer your question, which I don't have the answer to, let me repeat that, which is I think the voters dictate that. Because if you say it loud enough and long enough, they have to answer you, right? I think about Kamala, when she was speaking and there was protesting happening, you know, she did one of the things that only a black woman could do, which I love, and every black woman loved her for it, which was she said, if you want to vote for Trump, just say it. I'm speaking right now. Right? Part of me loved that. Because that's like my mom. That's a black woman. You want a black woman president, you're getting it. She's gonna give it to you, right? But at the same time, it's your question. Well, these issues matter to these voters. And if we don't answer the questions of these voters, will they show up? Right? Because what also I'm realizing in this generation is that they're not choosing a side just because that's what they were told to do or what their parents did. They actually want to be recruited. Like they want to be recruited. Oh, you want me? Tell me why I actually should be voting for you. Realistically, what is it you're gonna do? You know. So I hope that at least gives you some food for thought for your question. Is that the voters dictate that? And I would just, yeah, for sure. Let's hope.
I must admit, when I see the word assimilation, I automatically think about how well that worked with the Native Americans and caused so much harm. It just, yeah, I have a hard time going in that direction at all.
Yeah, no, it's become so much of our country's identity. Because again, remember, I'm in kindergarten. We're all the same. So if anybody comes in one day and they might smell a little differently because they had curry the night before, or the hair might look a little different because, you know, it's different texture or different, then you automatically were singled out. You automatically were different, and nobody is different. How dare you be different? We're all the same, right? And so that begins the conditioning. Right? And then when you come across things that are different, you're like, oh, that's not how that's supposed to be done. You know? And if you don't travel, you don't experience different cultures, then it's even worse. Right? So for somebody who was elected in the town of Hartford, I'll give you a quick story. When I was elected in the town of Hartford, I would have conversations with, you know, citizens and constituents and friends. And oftentimes I would ask them, I would say, hey, you know, we had a great conversation just now. Like we talked for 30, 40 minutes, talked about passions, talked about life, talked about all the issues, right? And you enjoyed yourself, did you not? Yeah, James had a great time. Like, it's been so long since I've talked this way. And I said, well, I'm just curious, you know, because I'm big on humility. I'm big on, really humility and relatability. So I asked them, and I asked every person this question. And they would say, so other than me right now, When was the last time you spoke to somebody of color that wasn't required to speak to you because they were like working or serving or doing something, right? But you just genuinely had a conversation with them about passions in life and experiences and things of that nature. And the answers that I would get would, and this is true story, the answers I would get would be, since college, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I couldn't tell you. Now, remember, we're in Vermont, so you're talking about like an average age of 65? You ever been to college in 45 years? So it's been 45 years since you had a conversation, but you're also a very liberal community? Doesn't quite add up, does it? Right? But, so that's, you know, some of the things we have to understand in your community, right, is that even when there's difference of theories and thoughts, diversity will always bring more diversity of thought and larger diversity of thought, right? Last thing I'll share, if there's no other questions, and I do a lot of DEI talks, and people always, okay, question man? Okay, is people always ask, well, why DEI, why DEI, all these things, all these questions about DEI, and I always kind of revert back to the economic benefits of it as well, because that's what drives us in this country is economics and money and GDP, things of that nature. If you look at some of the largest states and the most economically advanced states or communities or really whatever you want to look at, they're diverse. There's a direct correlation between diversity and wealth. So if your argument is that, oh, there's no, you know, corporate benefit, there's no, well, numbers say differently. Ben, I'm sorry.
Another interesting thing about the point you just made about like having conversations with people of color is that there are so few here. Mm-hmm. Like, I forget what we're rated on, like the diversity of states, but this is a very white state, and so I'm sure that factors into that, but it's still a very good point.
Yeah, no, for sure, no question. 97%, last I saw, 96%.
Well, we're in a race with Wyoming on that.
Wyoming, okay. I didn't know if it was North Dakota or South Dakota, but I guess it was Wyoming. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Any feedback? You know, the floor is yours. Thank you for letting me into your sanctuary. I was somebody that was raised in the church. My uncle was my bishop, my pastor for really all my life. And so I am a church-raised kid, and so I know how sacred this house is, and so I greatly appreciate you allowing me into your space, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for just wonderful to have you here. Thanks. And is anybody going to make closing remarks? Because if not, you are. Okay.
I will, because I'm the president of Vermont Law and Graduate School. How proud do you think I should be to have this wonderful presentation? Somebody taught you well. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks, everybody.
Well, actually, I do want to say one more thing, which is, yes, there are many, many problems that we need to be talking about. But I want to go back to something that Jameson said, which is, you know, was pointing out again and again, which is it makes a huge difference which side wins. It makes a huge difference which side wins. Yes, we're going to have the same problems either way. Who do you want to have addressing those problems? And that makes a huge difference. So please, whoever it is that you support, get out there and work with all your time, energy, and resources now. Please. Thank you. It makes a huge difference.